Welcome, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the 7th Ramsay Lecture of 2019, except this time it's not a lecture, it's a conversation. Slightly different format, but there will still be time for, we hope, for plenty of questions from the floor afterwards. My name is Simon Haines. I'm the director of the Ramsay Centre, but I also, as I've said before, wearing this tie, I also have some close affiliations to the Chinese world through 9 years of teaching at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So in many ways, the theme or themes this evening are particularly close to my heart as well as to the speakers. And we are delighted to welcome as our guest this evening, Anastasia Lin, who is, as many of you would know, an award-winning actress, a beauty pageant title holder, and human rights advocate, not necessarily in that order. In 2015, Anastasia Lin won the Miss World Canada title and was all set to represent Canada at the Miss World pageant in China. However, she was refused a visa and declared persona non grata by the Chinese authorities in Beijing for her outspoken views on China's human rights record. The news of this rejection and Anastasia's subsequent attempt to enter China, all of which was filmed on major TV networks, this caused global media attention for a long time, many weeks, months, leading to, among other things, a front-page article in the New York Times and op-eds in major newspapers. Since then, Anastasia Lin has been invited to speak at many forums, including the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., the Oxford Union, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the Geneva Human Rights Summit, the Oslo Freedom Forum, and she's also testified in the US Congress, in the UK Parliament, and in the Taiwanese Legislative Assembly. So the Ramsay Centre is in exalted company here, and we're very honoured that she's now speaking to us. I should mention, by the way, that Anastasia is currently the scholar in residence at the Centre for Independent Studies on Macquarie Street, our close neighbour and good friends. She has appeared in over 20 films and television productions, often works at the confluence, the conjunction of activism and acting, playing roles that carry messages about freedom and human rights. Her films have received many awards, including the Gabriel Award for Best Feature Film, the Mexico International Film Festival's Golden Palm Award, and the California Indie Fest Award of Merit. She also won the Best Leading Actress in a TV Movie at the Leo Awards in 2016, and she's just released a new documentary film entitled, if I'm saying this right, The Badass Beauty Queen, which we're, forgive my American accent, doesn't sound as good in Australian, which we're about to see a short clip from before we begin our conversation. Anastasia was one of 11 stakeholders selected to meet with the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird upon the establishment of Canada's Office of Religious Freedom. Her articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, the Globe and Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and just the other day in the Australian on the weekend as well. So, in a minute we can welcome her properly, but before we do that, we're just going to show a short clip from Badass Beauty Queen.
If you told me 2 years ago I'm going to be facing the situation I'm facing, I wouldn't believe it. It sounds like a movie.
I should use my liberty to advocate for theirs.
The university student, actress, and human rights activist, Chinese-born Anastasia Lin is taking on yet another challenge.
Millions have been imprisoned, tortured, and sexually assaulted.
Her father was receiving threats. as a result of her outspokenness against human rights abuses in China.
It is possible to stand against tyranny.
One second, I'm going to take off my braces. China's #1 public enemy still have braces.
She was convinced that she was going to get to go to China and that she was going to have this platform to speak directly to the Chinese people. She finds out that the pageant has been relocated to Sanya, China.
I had to choose between silence and my hope for a better China.
The plan was to pose as a tourist with the camera around my neck, hit record to capture whatever I could.
China does not recognize a second passport. She crosses the border, she is Chinese property.
那么中共肯定是不喜欢这个。
I would like to ask India to press for answers.
The more visible a target she may become, ironically, the more protected she would become.
There's one contestant missing from the event.
This looked like a colossal mess.
What is China doing on the Human Rights Council in UN?
My platform, speaking out for freedom of thought in China, was what got me here. And I need to live up to it.
She's going right into the eye of the hurricane.
Her own life is at risk.
You don't need to be Miss World to be able to have the world hear you.
My story is only the tip of the iceberg.
I feel like I should apologize on behalf of our North American marketing team for that name.
No,
But
that's okay, that's fine. Well, Anastasia, so you've spoken and written eloquently in many fora about major policy issues relating to China and the West, including human rights questions, organ transplants you've spoken about, trade matters such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the role of China at the WTO. I know you've got thoughts about this. And also the acute dilemma, in some ways a particularly Australian dilemma, of our own commercial and strategic relationship with China. But the Ramsay Centre, as I'm always saying, is an education enterprise. So I'll be focusing probably more on education matters as we go along. But I'd like to start, if you don't mind, at a more personal level, especially given what we've just seen. Given that the bulk of your work as a creative artist lies in short films discussing the plight of dissidents and what it's like to find yourself seriously out of favour with the Chinese government. So I wonder if, first up, you could tell us something about your own childhood and formative years, your school years in China, and how they seemed to you at the time in the kinds of roles that you found yourself playing, like a kind of cheerleader, I think. But then how they came to look to you in retrospect, how it felt to change your perspective once you emigrated. So impressions of the school system, the university system maybe in China, and then how it felt to you looking back on that from outside.
So my name is Anastasia Lin. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you so much for coming here. And thank you very much to the Ramsay Center for inviting me to be here to speak to you today. Well, I was born in China and I spent the first 13 years of my life there. When I was in China, my father, he's a businessman, quite a successful businessman in the past, and my mother, she's a professor at university for Western economics. So I guess one can say that I grew up in a communist elite family, because the structure of the society in China, it's in such a way that if you are intelligent, if you're successful, if you are doing better than the rest of the crowd, then you are automatically attracted to being a Communist Party member, because they want to encourage everyone to sort of feel like that is a higher social status. So when I was in elementary school and high school for 2 years in China, my element would automatically make me qualified to be a communist youth leader. And that's precisely what I did. And when I was there, the indoctrination started in kindergarten, but it's in the form of songs. It's in the everyday, it's the pictures on the wall. It's the Mao picture right in the center of the room, but it's just everywhere. So it's very hard to detect that as a form of indoctrination. It was only after I came to the West did I actually learn more about the real Chinese culture. So I did, when I was in high school, especially at that time, 9/11 happened. A lot of the political turmoil in China happened. For example, the persecution of Falun Gong. And I remember specifically the 9/11 incident in China. At that time, it was somewhat praised by the Chinese media as a punishment for the American imperialism. See, they learned their lesson. And after we watch the official Chinese propaganda, oftentimes it's my job to organize my fellow classmates to have a formal discussion, and everyone have to show their opinion. And of course, there is only one opinion you can talk about. So, and I felt really proud because I was the leader speaking on stage, and there is a hierarchy that's going on. The more loyal or aligned you are with the Communist Party, the higher the status you are in China. It didn't feel morally wrong, because that's just the norm and that's how everyone is.
So somehow when you left that space and looking back in on it from the outside, this polarized your feelings in some way. This is when you became an activist. What was it about that change that made you do that? How is it that your activist convictions and the creativity which was kind of unleashed when you left had all been constrained by the same atmosphere before? How did the change happen?
It's a very long process, and sometimes I have some Australian friend who used to tell me that, I wonder why Chinese immigrants, when they come to Australia, the free world, they breathe the air of freedom, why don't they change their mind? Well, it takes one fearless self-examination to recognize what you have been taught from childhood might not be right. And that change happened to me when I was about 14 years old. So I moved to Canada when I was 13 years old with my mother. And I think the primary reason for her to move is that she recognized, she's a professor herself, so she recognized that Chinese education isn't the best for me. And my personality is also a bit more stubborn and outspoken. So being in a society like that might be actually quite dangerous for me. So she thought that bringing me to Canada is the best move she can have. And I do agree, it is the best. And I do thank my mother very much for doing that. And after I moved to Canada, in the first year of high school, I remember this, there was a Chinese exchange scholar teacher program that came to my high school. And I remember sitting in the social science class, is what we call it, social science. And I remember my teacher was talking about communism. And later on, the Chinese teachers, they were listening to the class, and they came to me and said that it doesn't seem like their view of our country is all that positive. And I remember myself telling them how to combat the Western democratic rhetoric against China. And that's what I did as a 13-year-old child. And when I was 14 years old, I think my mother see a very big problem that I was living in a bubble, because all my news source was from Chinese website, because my English wasn't good enough for me to read freely, and I was very thirsty for information. So I read Chinese websites. Of course, most of the Chinese website would be pro-Beijing. And that was back in 2003, and now it's even worse. So I absorbed news not from the free world, and she thinks that if I am to to integrate to the community here, to the Western society here, I need to open up my mind. So what she did is that she brought back a newspaper from Hong Kong. At that time, freedom of speech in Hong Kong is still quite open, and at that time.
Maybe not.
Yeah, and
we'll come to this.
We will. And also she brought back a small flyer of that Falun Gong practitioner distribute on the street. And I remember this incident very clearly because Falun Gong is being propagated as a cult in China. And I personally have indoctrinated my fellow classmate about it. There were no doubt in my mind about what they are, their nature, as the communists portray them to be. And after I read the booklet, it blew my mind away because I couldn't think that it was possible for such an opposite truth to exist. That they might be just lay Buddhists who believe in Chinese traditional values. And it was very interesting later on to watch these Chinese social activists, like the Falun Gong practitioner, pro-democratic activists coming from China, and their journey was also a very interesting observing experience for me. And I saw that, and that just started to make me question a lot of things. So I went online to research about Tiananmen Massacre, which the Hong Kong newspaper would talk about when June 4th came along. And I watched the video of Chinese youth in Tiananmen Square, how they actually stood in front of tanks. And I felt so proud as a Chinese for the first time. And I knew it wasn't motivated from a position of nationalism or patriotism. It was really proud for that young man as a human being. And then it was very exciting for me to know that there's this whole world out there that I could explore. And like the thing about indoctrination is that the person receiving the indoctrination, you always know that there's a truth down there. It's there, even though it tries to come up once in a while through a reason, but you just don't dare to live it or admit it.
Well, this is really interesting. I wonder if you can kind of develop this a little bit and think, you mentioned your mother, and I know that your father being left behind in China was a huge thing for you both. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how it felt for the older generation, your parents' generation, to endure and survive the Cultural Revolution, and then the years of relative openness in the era of Deng Xiaoping afterwards. And then the more recent era of Xi Jinping, which in some ways some people say is a kind of throwback to earlier times. How do you think the mental climate of the kind of thing you're talking about impacted on that generation? You've talked a bit about this, the clash in their minds between some sorts of traditional Chinese values like filial piety, for example, and the kinds of indoctrination that were happening in the era of the Cultural Revolution. Can you talk about that a little bit? Filial piety particularly, I think, is something that you've thought about.
Yes, filial piety is what Chinese Confucius value praised as the virtue that trumps all virtue.
All other virtues.
Is the number one of the 100 virtues. And
Xiao, right?
Xiao.
Xiao.
That's right.
My Chinese accent is worse than my American accent.
You're forgiven.
And the thank you. And the symbol is of a younger man carrying an older man on his back, or something like that, as I recall, of the symbol of filial piety, right? The letter.
Yeah. I think the idea of filial piety, from a Western perspective, maybe this is how I can explain it. It's about a continuity of tradition. Respecting your parents does not mean you take on the burden of your parents at an older age, but more like a respect for and a gratefulness for what they have given you. I guess the closest idea in the West is the idea of being grateful in Christianity. When you pray before eating every day, to be grateful for what you receive. And this is the Chinese way of giving back for the one who have raised you. So that's why it is the number one virtue. And during the Cultural Revolution, these Chinese tradition has been the number one enemy of the Communist Party for taking total control of the Chinese citizens' mind and heart. And in a way, humanity and conscience is the number one enemy of Communist
Because
Party.
children were encouraged to betray their parents rather than
to denounce their parents as anti-revolutionary.
The opposite of the traditional virtue.
And that created a lot of anxiety within the family, that parents don't even dare to speak their minds to their children. Family members were turned against each other. And these youth, out of ideology and passion, and the Red Guards have sometimes turned their own family member in jail.
And I know this only after I came out of China, and I have listened to my father talk to me sometimes. And he does not speak his true mind, even to me.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that
even to his own daughter.
I do not hear about what they've been through in Cultural Revolution until after I got out, and I have to question my mother repeatedly. Because this is not something that they feel they have the courage to tell their children. Because when you go to school, the school teacher would ask them, what did your parents say to you at home? And the children sometimes will naively just tell, and that turned their parents in.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what I want to do now is play devil's advocate for a minute, because after all, the Ramsay Centre is about open debate and putting all sides of the question. So what would you say about the argument that's often advanced that since the 1980s, the Communist Party has brought an era of unprecedented stability and prosperity to a country with a history full of upheavals and civil strife and invasion and colonialism? What would you say to that argument? That in fact we should be grateful, Chinese people should be grateful to the party for what it's achieved?
And first of all, I don't think the stability is really true. China have gone through movements after movement, disaster after disaster, and a lot of these disasters are man-made. For example, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the famine that created, starved so many Chinese people to death. The Cultural Revolution that took away our traditional culture, the humanity, that was created by Communist Party. And also some people say that the Communist Party has loosened their bound on Chinese people. But if they didn't bound the Chinese people in the first place, what's the point of losing the bound? You have to capture the people and then liberate them. And they always pose themselves as the savior. But in truth, they have captured the Chinese people's freedom to live an authentic life since they have captured the regime. And I want to explore this in detail. This is a journey that I went through after I came to the West. And it's not in 1 or 2 years, it's actually about a decade of length. First, in my high school year, getting in touch with the Chinese human rights activists, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Falun Gong practitioners, and the democratic movement activists, they went on the street to protest. Now, the freedom of protest does not exist in China. So that's something new to me. And looking at the Western MPs coming out and talk about things and try to mobilize and tell the West about the truth. And I didn't really get the point of why are they doing this. And I understand there's this idea of democracy, that people, due to whatever their information source, they have a right to choose their future. And Chinese people never had the right to choose their future under communist regime. And that's a new idea. So after that, I went to university. And going to university, I got the chance to read Plato. And my favorite book, The Republic. And the reason why The Republic is my favorite book is because it taught me two things. One is that individual liberty is a responsibility. And secondly, individual thought, freedom of thinking, of intellect, is also risky, and it takes courage. Because I remember specifically that, in China, oftentimes the youth are encouraged to use extreme languages and extreme action to condemn the government's enemy. And we can see them on Australian campuses now when they shout sexist, foul language to shout down the pro-Hong Kong protesters, or that they have tear down the Lennon Wall, trying to just cover the other side of the debate. And that was motivated by something that was injected into their blood since they were very young. It's in disguise of nationalism and patriotism. So, and then I read Socrates. The second tier of Guardian, which is the silver auxiliaries, they are they're guided by honor and glory. Yet the gold class of Guardian is guided by reason. And that is just, it came clicking to me. So all my life, what I thought was glorious and honorable and defending my country, that is not
guided by my true thinking. That is perhaps motivated by the exterior. And wisdom is beyond all of that.
It's probably picky of me to point out that some people have said that the guardians in the Republic became the model for a self-appointed guardian class who think they are cleverer and more intelligent than everybody else and have the right, therefore, to be philosopher kings and run undemocratically run the country.
Well, the whole system is set up that they have
pedantic of me, I know.
Are they self-appointed?
Well, they're appointed by a process which tends to always appoint the same group. Yeah.
It's selected, right?
Yeah.
But also there is mobilization between the classes.
Yeah.
If your quality is good enough, I think that involves intelligence and most of all courage to take the step of taking that responsibility of wisdom.
It gave rise to that wonderful Douglas Adams joke about a planet of humans who are run by a government of lizards. And every year they elect the lizards, and somebody says, why? And they said, well, if we didn't vote, the wrong lizard might get in. Anyway, remaining with this question of Chinese capacity for innovation, really, that we were talking about a minute ago. And just very briefly, Anastasia, I wonder if I'm sure you know about the Qian Shui Zhen question. Have you heard about this before? Thank you. Say it again.
A lot of our phonetic inventory is not in the West.
Language.
That is fine.
But the story is this was a famous Chinese rocket scientist and engineer trained at MIT and at Caltech who fell under suspicion during the McCarthyist era of being a communist. And so essentially he was thrown out of America in the 1950s and then basically went home and created China's aerospace and rocket and satellite program. So a wonderful man who achieved terrific things for his country. But he then asked the then Premier, Wen Jiabao, in 2005, and this was the question, why does China produce so many clever people, but so few geniuses? That was his question. And this has resonated. This is something that the party, I believe, has asked itself repeatedly. Why is that? What is it about the education system that does this, if he's right? And this is to do with the theme of innovation and creativity, which is where we started. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yes, because the education system in China encourages obey instead of challenge. You cannot challenge your predecessors. You have to think inside a box. You have to abide to the communist line. Only that way you're safe. And this is why China's scientists, I guess I could say this, don't have the quality of Western scientists that dare to go out of where they don't know and to explore with their own path, with their own wisdom, their own reason, to go there. And Chinese scientists are often discouraged from going there. And I think there are a lot of clever people because naturally Chinese work ethic is very good.
Fantastic.
We're very hardworking
all those tiger
people.
moms, right?
I lived with them, so yes. Yeah, and that's a traditional Chinese value that shouldn't be accredited to Communist Party.
Of course.
But we're trained to obey. And this is something that also comes back to Plato, if you don't mind me talking about the Republic a little more. And my favorite allegory in history is allegory of the caves. And it's because it also described my process of coming from that chained position and looking only onto a wall and seeing the shadow passing in front of me without knowing the truth and the layer of true human experiences that are underneath. And after reading that allegory, I discovered, yes, the path to wisdom and to discover something that is true and authentic and eternal takes courage and it's painful. And I remember reading Socrates describing the process of that chained man starting to turn his head and using his limbs to climb out of the cage and being dragging out of the cage and how much he's unwilling to take that path, yet he took it. And how painful it is. It takes a lot of courage to utilize your own faculty. and to reach your own conclusion because you have to take responsibility for it. You can no longer rely on a party, on a state taking responsibility for individual action. But at the same time, it's liberating because you're experiencing the life in your own way, in the way that God has assigned to you, has given to you.
And that's wonderful. And I'm just thinking this bears directly on the theme of education. If you think of education as the word literally means, as bringing out of you what is already inherent in each individual, rather than force feeding, pouring into the head what's coming in from outside. And this is what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, and I think there is a reason back to education. I remember going to this Montessori school that my mom forced me to study for 2 days in because I had a tiger mom. She wanted me to get in touch with why there are many Westerners who go to that school system. And I think one thing that came out was that really resonated with me is that the system was to try to bring out the child's innate nature, not to struggle with it, not to make everybody the same, which is what in China the education system is trying to do. And I remember Socrates said, don't struggle with your shortcoming. Build your strengths. Build the new instead of struggling with the old. And education is a process to remember, to bring out the memory, exactly. Right? And that is just so wonderful to know. And I think all of a sudden then I had the courage to have self-acceptance, to just be okay with my experiences and my feeling and my own understanding of the world. Because for 13 years at least in my life that I was trained to deny all of that.
So thinking about your main theme on our invitation for this evening, which is to do with whether the Cultural Revolution is arriving in the West, and linking it to the education theme that we've been talking about, many people here will have come to an earlier lecture a few weeks ago given by a New York professor whom I think you know actually, called Jonathan Haidt. You've met John. And in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, Haidt talks about the recent phenomenon of campus witch hunts in the last 7 or 8 years, and they've happened at Berkeley, Yale, Evergreen College, Middlebury College, many places, where what seems to have happened is that weak campus leadership from the top down collapses in the face of aggressive denunciations by students and even colleagues sometimes of supposedly racist or sexist attitudes among the professors and the administrators. And Haidt says all of this is taking place in a wider social context of overprotective parenting, a call-out culture that you've talked about, safetyism is the word that Haidt uses, and also massively increased political polarization in the wider society. Now, you've linked this phenomenon in Western campuses to the Cultural Revolution itself, which some might say that's a big stretch. So what's the connection between all of that that's happening on American campuses and the Cultural Revolution in China of the 60s and 70s? Can you tell us about this? How do you see this as connected to the Cultural Revolution in China, this phenomenon of safetyism and the call-out culture in the United States and other Western countries?
I think they're similar in the ways that the goal of these campaigns are aimed not toward free thinking, individual thinking, free debate and exchange of ideas. They're aimed at absolute conformity. And that is what Cultural Revolution was for. So in the past, Red Guards have labeled their professors as anti-revolutionaries or the Four Olds. And
the Four Olds, can you tell us a bit about that?
Old culture, old tradition, old thinking, old religion.
Right. Great books. That's what we would talk of. Yeah.
And I see what's happening today on campuses that is a lot of the Western world is what it is today thanks to the Enlightenment ideas, that we are able to have this safe space to discuss our opinion to debate and refine them. And I think that is the process of one to be more firm in one's idea and to listen to others. And that is very important in the building of a character. And I think children today has been deprived of that, partly in their own doing. And when they label a certain things in a very victimizing, passive-aggressive way, it's very similar to when the Red Guards are saying that the professors are indoctrinating them with feudalist old ideas and it's harmful for the youth soul. And the position they're coming on is not, it's aimed at absolute conformity because they actually tell you, how do I explain this? In the Cultural Revolution, what often happened is that a Chinese person gets picked on by the government, and they're not exactly sure why they got picked on. So they come up with this list themselves of what might have went wrong, and they start to self-censor. And they would just ask the government, is this what I did wrong, or are you angry with that? And eventually, none of them worked out, then they would be like, okay, just tell me what to do. So this is how the absolute conformity comes about. And I think that's happening on Western campuses today, where a lot of debates are being stifled.
Although I suppose the difference is that it was sort of centrally planned in the Cultural Revolution by the governing party in a one-party state. And that isn't the same as what's happening on campuses in the West. That's a more spontaneous movement arising right the way across the society, but not being controlled by a central authority. Wouldn't that be a difference?
Though I don't know if it is completely all that naive and spontaneous.
Okay.
Because certain rhetorics just sound so as if people are trying to grab onto power through these movements. But of course, that is only my observation.
So what they have in common is that both movements are using slogans and ideas
to stifle the other
to
side.
Stifle thought and originality. Okay, very interesting. Well, look, I'm afraid I can't resist, Anastasia, talking about Hong Kong for a while. I hope you don't mind. You know I'm somebody who feels pretty strongly about what's been happening recently in Hong Kong, and we've all been watching the news. Let's talk about the Hong Kong question for a minute. And it strikes me, and I'd like to know what you think about this, that these millions and millions, I mean, the numbers are in the millions, of extremely well-behaved Hong Kong students out on the streets in the last 3 months, that they were probably radicalized by 2 earlier events in their earlier childhood. And I'm thinking about this in terms of your story about your childhood and being radicalized when you were about 13. Because the 2 earlier events in Hong Kong, one of them is the Umbrella Revolution, the Occupy Central movement of 2014, led in fact by somebody I know very well, Dr. Kin Man Chan, who I'm very proud to call a friend, a colleague at Chinese University who is now in jail, I might point out. So this happened when the current generation of protesting students were in their mid-teens. But then it seems to me that an even more formative moment for that generation of students was the attempt to introduce what was called a national education curriculum into Hong Kong primary and elementary schools in 2012. So this is 7 years ago, when the appalling C.Y. Leung was the chief executive of Hong Kong, even more impressive in his ability to ignore what everybody was saying than his successor, who is the current chief executive. So the attempt, the curriculum which was supposed to be introduced into primary schools was to foster a spirit of enthusiasm for Chinese communism, Chinese nationalism, and it was supposed to criticize democracy. But then after an outcry led by some of these students, and the black shirts began to appear then, and by their parents, it was dropped. The plan was dropped. And these students that we're watching on the streets today were those same primary and post-primary students who I think were radicalized by the national education fiasco in 2012. So we're back in the territory of doctrinal education where we started out this evening. What's your take on Hong Kong? What might happen? How we've come to be where we are? What do you think the future might hold? What would you say to young people in Hong Kong out on the streets at the moment worrying about 2047 and what's going to become of them during their lifetimes.
Does radicalization have a negative connotation in English?
Neither necessarily negative nor positive. It could be either. It's something that goes to makes you an activist radical. In some ways, you're radicalized.
Just from the sounds of it, it sounds there's an extreme element in there.
Sure. That often happens, a zealotry. Yes, this is true.
But I think given the stake of what they're dealing with today, if Communist Party suddenly start to indoctrinate their curriculum in Sydney, imagine how your kids are going to react to that.
But Hong Kong is Chinese, would be the argument. So it's fine to be a proud Chinese. Many Hong Kongers say we're Chinese.
They are Chinese, but they're the different kind of Chinese that have not gone through the indoctrination process. And they have the information of the free world. They know what freedom is. And that makes them very much different. The process I just described that I have gone through, they have experienced it when they were young.
Yeah, exactly.
In a way that's a different quality of human being. I'm not trying to be racist, but this is just my own experience. So what they're fighting today is their way of life. And I think these children, they know innately that their future is now. And they're in a very decisive moment. When I went to Hong Kong in 2015, there's something that I realized it's very different between Taiwanese and Hong Kong people. Because in Hong Kong, it's as if they know their freedom is been tightening up. And so they're fighting their freedom inch by inch. I met with many Hong Kong democratic movement activists, and they're very courageous. They know exactly what they might lose, and they're doing everything they can to defend it. But in Taiwan, it's sort of a different sort of atmosphere that the media is portraying China in a very different light, and that they want to believe in this illusion that unification with China is a good idea. And it's not touching their interests so much that they feel this urge to immediately defend something, even though it might also be in danger.
Why do you think that feeling is less strong in Taiwan than it is in Hong Kong?
I think it might actually have something to do with British education for the Hong Kong youth. Yeah, and maybe with recent events like the businessman who was abducted in broad daylight from a hotel because he had the wrong kind of links to the leadership in Beijing, or the bookseller, the bookseller story, or the Ming Pao editor who was hamstrung in the street because he was being too critical of the party. Things like this aren't happening in Taiwan in the way that they are in Hong Kong. They are also happening in Taiwan.
But they're also happening in Taiwan.
Taiwanese businessmen are being harassed, blackmailed, arrested in China. But the difference is that Hong Kong youth are much more outspoken, because I think there's also that by the time the handover is over and the 50 period is over,
the clock is already ticking.
Yeah, they know this is probably their destiny, but they will preserve what they can in a way. So it's an active struggle. But for Taiwan, it's like, we're fine. We don't know what the future holds, and that's not a certain destiny, even though it might actually be the same result.
Yeah, well, look, I've had lots of chances to ask questions, and I want to give everybody else a chance because I'm sure everyone's got some. But I just wanted to read to you at the end, just to get your take on this, Anastasia, an excerpt from the China Model Teaching Manual, which was the document at the heart of the national education curriculum controversy 7 years ago, just because I think this might be interesting to everybody and might resonate with you. So this was the key manual that was going to be distributed to primary schools in Hong Kong to guide the way that the national education curriculum would work in the future in Hong Kong primary schools. Of course, it didn't work, but this is just a short extract. The translation is available online. Unlike the system of regime change in Western democratic countries, China's ruling group mainly serves the country and the people, unlike the regime change in the West. The closeness of ruling philosophies and orientations inside the ruling group ensures the continuity of the regime and the stability of the society. In America, on the other hand, two majority parties hold power in turn. The two parties always refuse to pass the annual fiscal plan due to the need to campaign for votes or to arguments. Can't have that. This makes government shut down and public services stop. American media have statistics showing that the shutdown of American government costs taxpayers $1 trillion daily. That was in the centre of this new document that was going to be introduced in elementary schools in Hong Kong. How would you react to that, Anastasia?
Well, this is what I have been learning.
This is what you heard.
My 13 years
all
of
your
life. And you imagine why the Hong Kong student feels such an urge to go on the street.
And this is what they read when they were 13 years old.
Mm-hmm. Well, they have their very unique way of turning what is good into bad and what is bad into good.
Yes. Well.
And I guess they're largely successful at that. Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of Chinese people who have been learning this so much that they don't think about it twice. And a lot of them come here, still have their news sources from WeChat, from Chinese media, when they have the privilege to look at the outside. I guess not everybody have the opportunity and the privilege I did to have a mother like my own to actively open up my mind. But I think it also takes the Western universities to make that effort to help these students to open up their mind.
We hope so.
Things don't happen on their own. And I do hope that every Chinese student will get to read Republic. And probably they'll reach similar conclusion that I did.
Yeah. Thank you, Anastasia. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. There were so many more questions I was keen to ask, but I'd rather give everybody else a chance. I'm sure you've all got questions you'd like to put to Anastasia, so please feel free now. I've got Ian and then Karen. So, Ian Benson. Yes, I'm never on time.
Thanks very much. Ian Benson, University of Notre Dame, Australia, and formerly of Canada for many years. Canada and Australia are both major trading partners of China. Neither of them, despite their self-congratulatory support of human rights, have said much, if anything, about their trade relations correlating to respect for human rights. Have you got anywhere with the beautiful man in Canada, Justin Trudeau?
I live in New York now for that very specific reason. I think the West sometimes feel like if we just take that measured approach, that appeasement approach, that China maybe will change or will treat us better, but no. That's fundamentally an illusion because Chinese Communist Party has to look at the Western democratic value as an enemy, as a threat. Because otherwise, how do they legitimate their own rule to the Chinese people? So no matter how the Western politicians kowtow to China, they'll always take a hostile view toward the West and see everything you do as threats. So we might as well speak up. We might get our Australian citizen, Dr. Young, back.
Indeed.
My name's Karen Kuman. Thank you very much, Anastasia. I really enjoyed your reflections and thoughts, and it reminded me very much of my very different but somewhat similar experience as a daughter of a migrant from Europe. My father grew up in occupied Holland, and it was occupied by the Nazi Germany at the time, and he has a very black and white view of some things, and he also both about Nazism and about communism. And it took me a long time to reconcile his, forgive me for this expression, but an educated person's view. He didn't finish school, but he had very strong views, and so I really came to understand that his views were really about freedom versus authoritarianism, and it really didn't matter whether it was authoritarianism of Nazi Germany, or whether it was a threat of communism, which was also authoritarianism coming across Europe, which was a huge threat, which is why he came to Australia, why I exist. It was really about the ability of individuals to take control of their destiny versus the role of government or organisations to control that destiny for you. And so I find that an interesting background to politics generally, which I've studied most of my life, because there's a tendency to see things as black and white. There's communism China, which is possibly bad, and the free West, which is impliedly good. Whereas in fact there are power structures within both organisations. One is both societies. One is far more permeating on the individual than the other. But to me, I think after all of my studies, it's boiled down to what my father thinks is about authoritarianism versus the individual, regardless of what government it is. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that in terms of the debate, which is about communism versus the West, or whether it really is about authoritarianism in any form.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the question. Communism in China is not really communism in the sense, physically communism. Its only reason for the regime to stay power is that they want to continue to stay in power. And all those re-engineering of the soul that Stalin has talked about is a tool to solidify their regime. I do think it is individual freedom versus authoritarian, totalitarian education. But I do take a view that most of the communist countries have ended up in pretty bad shape. And communism in its central core is anti-nature, anti-humanity, because they want to take away all that is in you, that is kind, and oftentimes use it as a tool to stifle you, to hurt you more, to get you to obey to them. My example is a very good one. My father was used to threaten me. That is, they're using filial piety, care for your family, as a weapon against me. So I don't take any positive view on communism. I think every practicing of communism has came into failure. It's not that it's never been practiced, it's just doomed to fail.
Hi Anastasia, my name is Therese Horsford. I'm a student at Campion College, and I just wanted to ask you, thank you for your speech, and especially about how at the end I was very interested in how you turned and discussed in some ways the impact on universities, and how we have a lot of international students at our universities. What I particularly wanted to have your opinion on is recently, in the last few years, University of Sydney has released a new motto for their arts program, which I think everyone here is aware of, which is unlearned truth. And I wanted to ask you whether you think this is a good challenge of our of preconceived ideas, or of even coming out of the cave, or whether you think this is creeping indoctrination in the West.
I really would like more context on that, because unlearned truth is just such a brazen...
It was a PR program run by the University of Sydney last year and the year before, and this was the headline, was unlearn, and then there were all these things that you were supposed to unlearn, and one of them was truth. The idea is to question all your preconceived ideas and prejudices and opinions about everything. That's what universities are supposed to do, but not everybody saw it that way.
Well, that's very unfortunate. I do think that Western civilization is important because it does establish the ethic, the moral standard, and that is what helped to preserve our freedom here today. Because we had John Stuart Mills, because we had Adam Smith, because we had all these great philosophers who were inspired by Enlightenment ideas, we are able to live the way we live today. And that, I think, is under attack. And we need to preserve it. Because it's coming from someone who lived under a different kind of system, I come to appreciate it more. And I wish Westerners would appreciate it too.
Thank you. There was a gentleman just over there, Janine, and then there's a lady in a red scarf just there. Who's the next one?
Thank you, Anastasia. My name's Rick O'Brien. I'm a policy consultant, but not in education. My question is a broader one about the Chinese nation state and the general Chinese culture and your observations about the prospects of change in the medium to longer term. I think the short term, the answer is not much. And I wanted to touch on a number of points you made, including how communist the current government is, and indeed I think you're right in describing it more as a totalitarian and even mercantilist totalitarian regime, which is actually fundamentally a technological construction. It's even populated by engineers at the top, to come back to your term about engineering. And I'm wondering, given that fact, and given the cultural points you made earlier about the Han Chinese, Confucianism and other long-standing Chinese social philosophies as well as religious practices, how much you think the regime is capable of continuing to co-opt those values in the Han Chinese culture for its own purposes, combined with the totalitarian and technological manifestations, and succeed and continue to succeed economically, and so stave off any long-term political and democratic reform. Because it strikes me that at the moment they're doing a pretty successful job. They're pretty resilient, much more so than the neoliberals thought in the late 80s and early 90s. And I'm a generation older than you, and I'm not sure I'm going to see the change that you hope for.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it pointed out a very important Chinese Communist Party is not China. And we should all be very clear about that. The regime does not represent Chinese people or Chinese culture. Unfortunately, through the Cultural Revolution, what they have done is to train a generation of Chinese to totally kowtow to the communist line. And they don't have the courage, or they didn't have the courage to preserve their culture and their strength. And nowadays, because China's society is so worshiping money, and the commercialization is getting everyone very distracted from the things in their daily life. And that is that's a strategy that communists has played to distract people from pursuing something that's higher than money, spirituality, culture. And they have been very successful at that. If you have lived in China for just a very short period of time, I think everyone who have been there would observe that the life is just so fantastic. It's so, there's variety of entertainment. You have many different choices of many different things. And there's just always something that's going on, something new every single day. But deep down, there is a void. And if that void is filled once again, I think something about tradition, spirituality, moral ethic, philosophy is that it strengthens a person from within and gives the person the courage to take the steps that otherwise he wouldn't. And I think that's what Communist Party has been very successful in doing. And so I do believe that reviving China's ancient culture and tradition is a very effective way to end the communist rule. But I don't know when that's going to happen.
Some would say there's a void in the West as well. The lady here.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences. My name's Catherine Haines. I'm a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Sydney, and I'm trying very hard to learn as much as I can about the truth as quickly as I can. I am also in the position of tutoring undergraduate students, first, second, and third year philosophy students. And so I just wanted to pick up on some of your final comments, because actually just last week I was teaching the allegory of the cave. And it must be said that 25% at least of my students are international students, which means that 24.9% of them are Chinese. And I was also a Hong Kong school teacher for 6 years, so I do have some cultural understanding. My question is, at a really intimate level in the classroom, if you're speaking to one person and they cannot see that the myth of the cave resonates with their personal experience the way that you have said that it does for you, what do you do?
Oh, there's definitely universality in the different philosophies. If I may just take a little time, because this is a wonderful question that I really like to talk about. In traditional Buddhist school, there is a law that runs the universe. And in Socrates, the form, the sun in Allegory of the Cave, is the eternal truth. Those two are universal. Those two are, you could say, similar. And the Buddhist traditional spiritual tradition is actually not what the West understands it to be, that we see as, oh, detachment from everything and you can engage in different kind of activity and not taking responsibility for it. No, it's not. The essence of traditional Buddhism is for one to constantly decipher one's own reason and getting rid of the bad things, the attachment, in order to achieve a more authentic self. That a self that is not inhibited by desire and outside world distraction, a fully free person. In some way, I think that is similar to Christianity. When you have faith to believe in God, you can give up the bad desires that you don't have courage to give up. And you can hold on to God's power, and that will make you a better person because you're worth it. So I think these ideas are there. It's our job to sort of wake it up in these Chinese students. Because once that light is lit, there's no way to put it back down again.
Thank you. So there's a lady there.
Yes, good evening. Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the Ramsay Centre for holding this. I'd like to also celebrate a win with Anna. As you know, the Confucius classrooms have been closed in New South Wales. That's actually a very big win for the work that you do and so forth. However, the universities, there's about 13, I think, in Australia that some may be doing an internal review and so forth. What are your thoughts on this? And in the spirit of education, could you comment a little bit about why it's important, not just for the classrooms, but also the universities, this issue?
Thank you very much. And we're just meeting some warriors on the front line of fighting this Confucius Institute issue. And communists, they plan in generations. And this is in their own agenda. They actually are pretty proud of it. They say it in their speech, that they plan in generations, and they plan to indoctrinate the Western youth about what they are about. So Confucius Institute is this direct arm of propaganda department in China that disguises as a language and cultural program in the West. They're in a lot of universities and they have individual classrooms. And they are often directly funded by the Chinese government. They give you money to open a Confucius Institute. They will support you with staff, so the teacher has to be theirs, and it's Chinese trained teachers. And these teachers are often told to only tell one side of the story, of course. And if they're told to, they're being asked by students about Tibet, Uyghur, they're supposed to avoid the question. And if they cannot avoid it, they will give the Chinese Communist official answer. They plan in generations, because imagine your kid's been 5, 7 years old and sending to Chinese school. And the songs they learn is, I love Beijing Tiananmen. Tiananmen has the sun risen. And the great leader Mao will lead us to glory, and that's why we have to march forward. And these kind of songs...
You're channeling your 13-year-old self.
I just felt it, well. Remembering that. And so you imagine what your children's gonna feel. Like these influences are subtle, and oftentimes I don't think the parents would notice it, because you don't speak Chinese. But if you want to see Caucasian students singing Maoist songs, go to Confucius Institute. And I don't think that's a place where you want to send your children to. And often these Confucius Institute in universities will also help to stifle debate in that university campus. One of our screening of In the Name of Confucius, which is a documentary that I acted in that talks about how Toronto School Board kicked out Confucius Institute. It was canceled, the screening was canceled in Victoria University in September 2008, and that was due to the pressure of both Confucius Institute and the Chinese consulate. So it poses a significant threat to our academic freedom on campus.
Can you take 2 more questions? Is that all right?
Yes.
I feel we're working you pretty hard.
Oh, no, I'm
Is that
very
all right?
happy.
So there's a young man here.
Hi, Anastasia. My name's Will Jeffries, and I'm a Sydney University student. In our humanities classes, we are given this monolithic view of looking at the world. Every societal outcome or relationship is determined by power structures, which are demarcated upon racial, socioeconomic, or gender lines. I'm wondering, as a Chinese student in one of these classes, how this would either contradict their nationalistic socialism or reinforce it.
Well, I think it's probably quite hard for these Chinese students to understand why the West are perpetrating this kind of view, because in some way it's in contradiction to their communist the education that they receive in the West, even though the fundamental goal is the same. I think now the real resources we have in the West is in our classical texts, is in our philosophy books, that these things that you can get from the library and read on your own. I do have a very big suspicion for our higher education in the West these days. I just said it on record today, didn't I? Because I do see it going in a direction where it does not encourage the very fundamental value that Western democracy and civilization has stood for all these thousands of years.
So one more.
Anastasia, can I ask you why you have you're a Chinese lady, you have a Greek name, and secondly, can I ask, I'm a pastor in the city here, and it seems to me we had a lot of Chinese students and others who are Christians. The church in China has more Christians than the church in America now. 10 years ago, that seemed to be tolerated. Do you think it's true that the government is now worried about that? I'm particularly aware in Shanghai of about 1,000 churches losing their status and so on. Has something changed, or is that just a perception that we've got? Are you aware of what's going on?
Well, first, about my name, yes, Anastasia. Do you know what it means in Greek?
Resurrection.
That's right. It's resurrection. My Chinese name is Lin Ye Fan. Ye means Yahweh. Fan means mortal. So my mom gave me this name. It basically means Jesus. It's Yahweh and mortal combined. So I don't know why my mother gave this name to me, and I have always felt not really, I didn't like it when I was in China, because every other girl had a very feminine name, and I had the name of Jesus. And only after I came to the West and I read the stories in the Bibles was I really encouraged and feel fortunate to have this name. I think in some way, this really symbolizes that even though China has an atheist regime right now, deep down Chinese people, that humanity, it can never be killed. It only takes that spark of fire to light it up again. A spark of fire like Hong Kong. And that's why the information censorship, the war of disinformation, the Chinese Communist Party is really trying to fight it, because they don't want Chinese people to see hope. Now, back with the Chinese Christians. Yes, Chinese Christians are growing, and it's, I think, the fastest growing in the world, perhaps. Yeah, but another thing is that they're very atomized. So we don't hear a lot about their stories. They're not like, in some way, Falun Gong practitioners who are actively trying to fight against the persecution and build their own network and sending out all those persecution stories outside and have the Chinese perpetrators on the internet just to, to let the outside world know. But Chinese Christians, their treatment is mostly I just met with Chinese human rights lawyer a few days ago, and it's really encouraging to hear that there are a lot of Chinese Christians who are, once they discovered the message of God, is almost like that there is something inside they will not give in, and they will persist. And it will be interesting to see how that develops in the future.
Well, savior, badass beauty queen, impressive exponent of Plato's allegory of the cave, also living the cave, I think, in your own life. It's an extraordinary story, Anastasia. We're very lucky to have heard from you. Thank you very much for being with us. And can everybody join me in thanking Anastasia Lin?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It's a privilege.